In February 1943, the war in the East seemed decided. The German Sixth Army was gone, erased at Stalingrad. A torrent of Soviet armor and infantry now poured west, chasing the remnants of a broken Wehrmacht. On February 16th, the city of Kharkov fell without a fight. For the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, this was not just a victory. It was confirmation. They believed the enemy was morally and structurally shattered. All that remained was the pursuit. But battlefields hide secrets in plain sight. Along the frozen roads leading from Kharkov, Soviet tank crews were leaving vehicles by the roadside. Not from enemy fire, but from broken tracks, overheated engines, and empty fuel tanks. They were confident they would be recovered later. Meanwhile, German intelligence reports noted a strange phenomenon. Panzer divisions, which they knew were critically under strength, kept reappearing in combat at near full operational readiness. The official narrative of this battle speaks of a brilliant general and his elite panzers. But the real story is quieter. It's not about the strength of a tank's armor or the caliber of its gun. It's about the wrenches and the men who used them in the dark. The conventional history of the Third Battle of Kharkov is a masterclass in operational art. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, facing overwhelming odds, refuses to panic. Instead of defending ground he cannot hold, he pulls his forces back, stretching Soviet supply lines to their breaking point. He gathers his elite armored units, the SS Panzer Corps with its Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions. These are formations at the peak of their fighting power, freshly refitted and re-equipped. On February 19th, Manstein unleashes his counterstroke. The overextended Soviet spearheads, starved of fuel and ammunition, are caught completely by surprise. The Germans execute a classic backhand blow, striking the flanks of the advancing Soviet armies. The new Tiger tanks, with their fearsome 8.8-centimeter guns, make their presence felt. Stuka dive bombers from Luftflotte 4 control the skies. By March 15th, the SS Panzer Corps has retaken Kharkov after brutal street-to-street fighting. It's a stunning reversal. A tactical masterpiece that stabilized the front and is still studied in war colleges today. The narrative is clean, compelling, and heroic. A story of genius and elite troops snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. But this story leaves one critical question unanswered. Where did all the panzers come from? German military records from early 1943 tell a different story than the triumphant newsreels. The core of Manstein's striking power was the Panzer Division. On paper, a division's Zollstärke, its authorized strength, was over 100 tanks. But the reality on the ground, the Ist-Stärke, was grim. After months of brutal winter combat, most Army Panzer divisions were shadows of their former selves. A commander was lucky to field 30 or 40 operational tanks on any given day. This gap between paper strength and combat reality was not a temporary problem. It was the structural condition of the German army on the Eastern Front. The rate of loss from both combat and mechanical failure consistently outpaced the replacement capacity of German industry. The SS Panzer Corps was an exception, having been reorganized and brought closer to its authorized strength. But it was fighting alongside army units that were worn to the bone. The official story of a mighty armored fist requires hundreds of tanks. The logistical records show that Fist was missing several fingers. If a standard division was operating with only 30 panzers, how could it possibly generate the combat power to destroy entire Soviet armies? The numbers do not add up. The answer lies in units that rarely appear in divisional histories. Their names were not glamorous. Panzerinstandsetzungszuege, tank repair platoons. Werkstattkompanien, workshop companies. These were the organic maintenance units assigned to every German armored formation. They operated according to a simple, ruthless principle. Any vehicle not utterly destroyed by enemy fire had to be recovered, repaired, and returned to the front. The deadline was 24 hours. A tank that could not be made operational within that window was classified as a tactical loss. To meet this demand, the repair crews worked in direct proximity to the front lines. They set up their workshops in captured barns or camouflaged clearings, sometimes within range of enemy artillery. Their job was to prevent a damaged tank from becoming a total write-off. They were not just mechanics. They were part of the combat system. They understood that a Panzer with a thrown track was useless to a commander who needed it for an attack in 3 hours. These crews were the invisible bridge between a division's crippling losses and its surprising ability to fight another day. They were turning broken steel back into weapons. But how significant was their contribution, really? As Manstein's counteroffensive gained momentum, the evidence of a systemic Soviet weakness became impossible to ignore. For weeks, Soviet tank units had been advancing at a blistering pace. Their maintenance structure was designed for this kind of operation, a rapid forward push. It was not, however, designed for systematic, in-depth repair under pressure. When a T-34 broke down, the crew often had two choices: wait for a recovery vehicle that might never come, or abandon it and join another crew. In a system built for quantity, a single lost tank was an acceptable cost. But the costs were adding up. A broken-down tank, once its crew leaves, quickly becomes an irreparable loss. Scavengers take parts. The weather takes its toll. Or, most critically, the ground it sits on falls into enemy hands. While German repair crews worked tirelessly to salvage every possible machine, Soviet tanks were being lost to attrition that had nothing to do with the enemy. The momentum of the Soviet advance had covered up a fatal flaw in its logistical doctrine. When that momentum was finally broken, the flaw was exposed. The illusion of overwhelming strength began to crack. Archived after-action reports and divisional logs reveal the true impact of the German repair system. Across the Eastern Front, estimates indicate that in any given week of fighting, a staggering 20 to 30% of a division's operational tanks were vehicles that had been repaired in the field. They were ghost Panzers, written off as losses in one report, only to reappear on the frontline roster days later. This wasn't a miracle. It was a system. A Panzer IV that had stopped dead with a broken final drive shaft, a common failure, was not a catastrophic loss. For a trained Werkstattkompanie with the right parts, it was a task that could be completed in 6 to 8 hours. A tank disabled in the morning could be back with its unit for an evening counterattack. This is the multiplier effect that the Soviet planners never saw. They counted German losses and extrapolated a future of German weakness. They saw 30 tanks in a division and assumed that number could only go down. They failed to understand that the Germans were not fighting with 30 tanks. They were fighting with a system that could consistently keep 30 tanks in the battle, drawing from a pool of broken-down machines that the Soviets would have simply left behind. The Soviet failure was not one of courage, but of cohesion. The German repair system kept Panzers in the fight, and those Panzers, guided by superior radio communication, began to dismantle the Soviet offensive piece by piece. The effect cascaded through the Soviet front. Units would report they were under heavy tank attack, while neighboring units just a few miles away continued to advance, oblivious. They were fighting blind. Commanders radioed for fuel that never arrived because German Panzers had ambushed the supply columns miles to there. Tank brigades pushing boldly into towns like Kharkov without their infantry support were suddenly isolated. They lost vehicles to close assault weapons because the infantry who were supposed to protect them were stuck, their transport having been destroyed by the same German tanks that were supposedly defeated weeks ago. The Soviet advance didn't just stop, it disintegrated. A stalled engine on the roadside was no longer just a mechanical problem, it was a symptom of a system collapsing under the weight of its own success, a success that had stretched it far beyond its capacity to sustain itself against an enemy that refused to die. This German resilience was not an accident. It was the product of a military philosophy. The German army's doctrine of Auftragstaktik, decentralized, mission-oriented command, did not stop with combat officers. It extended to the NCOs running the repair depots. They were empowered to make decisions, to prioritize which tank to fix first based on the tactical situation, without waiting for orders from a distant headquarters. Vehicle maintenance was not an afterthought in German training. It was an integral part of being a tanker. Crews were expected to perform basic repairs themselves. This culture created a qualitative superiority. It was a superiority in training, in leadership, and in maintenance. Under the specific conditions at Kharkov, this qualitative edge produced a multiplier effect. It allowed a numerically inferior force to temporarily and locally compensate for its weakness. This was no myth. It was a reproducible, operative result. But it was also a trap. This deep investment in training and experience could not be mass-produced. While these elite German mechanics were rebuilding a single Panzer IV, Soviet factories were shipping hundreds of new T-34s to the front. Germany was repairing its army. The Soviet Union was building a new one. The victory at Kharkov was real, but it was also an illusion. It was the last brilliant demonstration of a system that was fundamentally unsustainable. The excellence of the repair crews, the skill of the Panzer crews, and the genius of their commanders created the false hope that the war could still be won this way. They proved that a qualitative system could win the battle, but they could not change the fact that the quantitative system wins the war. A multiplier, no matter how powerful, shrinks when applied to a shrinking base. The highly trained formations that fought at Kharkov could not be replicated. Their quality was a finite resource burning itself out. Was this victory proof that the Wehrmacht could have won the war? Or was it simply the last time its system was superior enough to sustain the illusion of victory, just for a moment longer? The men with the wrenches won Manstein his battle, but they couldn't fix the strategic reality.